Good afternoon. First and foremost, I am so sorry about canceling class this morning. Uh, it was just a family emergency that came up out of the blue. However, we are going to get this chapter done. It's just seeming like there's been roadblocks for this chapter for the whole week. We're going to go over the biological psychology. We may have started, but just in case we haven't, I'm going to go ahead and start it from the beginning. Make sure you have fresh information, and hopefully it will go smoothly. So we're going to take a look at the structures of a neuron. We're going to understand what an action potential is and its purpose. We'll also learn and talk about the all or none law of the action potential, as well as talk about the synapses and how it's a communication type of network. So your brain consists of an enormous number of separate type of cells, and these are neurons. There are about 12 to 15 billion neurons within your cerebral cortex, and it's got also associated areas. 70 billion neurons would be within the cerebellum, and then there's 1 billion neurons that's located in the spinal cord. A lot of neurons then. All right. The nervous system, it also contains other types of cells, which is called glia. These support the neurons in many ways, such as insulation, synchronization, as well as helping neighboring neurons by removing wasted products. The glia are smaller, but they're even more numerous than the neurons themselves. Neurons are going to be similar to other body cells in a lot of different ways. The most distinctive feature of a neuron would be its shape, and it varies depending on whether they receive information from a source, from few sources, or a lot of different sources, and whether they send impulses over a short or long distance. So the neuron consists of three parts. That would be a cell body, or the soma, dendrites, and then the axon. The cell body, it'll contain the nucleus of the cell. The dendrites, which is a Greek word meaning tree, are like branches, tree, are widely branching structures that's going to receive input from other type of neurons. And then the axon is going to be this single long, thin, straight fiber that has branches near its tips. Now, some vertebrate axons would be covered with myelin. It's an insulating type of sheet, the myelin sheet. And what that does is help transmission by speeding it up along with the impulses along the axon. So basically, you want to kind of remember as a rule that an axon will transmit information to other cells, and the dendrites or cell body is going to receive and take in that information. Now, the function of an axon basically is going to convey information over these long distances, such as if we talk about when we have a feeling from the skin, something touches our skin, more or less that is going to be going from the spinal cord or from the spinal cord to the muscle. Axons basically will convey information by a process that's called an action potential. This is an excitation that'll travel along an axon at a constant strength, and no matter how far it travels, when the axon is saying yes or no, or on and off type messages, it's like thinking about flicking a switch on and off that doesn't have a dimmer. So it wouldn't be going like this, it's going up and down, on and off, on and off. Kind of get it? All right, well. Another term that you might hear me say in terms of action potentials would also be called neural impulses. Okay, but I want you to kind of stick to action potential and at least have an understanding that it serves its purpose to be able to get that information to travel along the axon. Okay. Also remember the all or none law, the fact that an axon cannot vary the strength or velocity of its action potential. So here's a quick description about how action potentials work. So when the axon is not stimulated, its membrane has a resting potential. This is an electrical polarization that's across the membrane, or actually it's covering of an axon. In addition, there's a mechanism that's called the sodium-potassium pump, and this pushes sodium ions out of the axon while pulling potassium ions into the axon. Consequently, these sodium ions are going to be more concentrated outside of the axon, and the potassium ions are going to be more concentrated inside. An action potential, or if you another way you might have heard it, a neural impulse, it's going to start in either two ways. First, many axons produce spontaneous activity. Secondly, input from other neurons can excite a neuron's membrane. Either way, if the excitation reaches the threshold of the axon, it briefly opens some gates in the axon through which sodium potassium ions can flow. These sodium ions, which are highly concentrated outside the membrane, will rush into the cell, attracted by the negative charge inside it. The influx of positively charged sodium ions is the action potential itself. So, as the positive charge enters the axon at one point, it stimulates the next point along the axon, which then starts opening sodium channels, and then it starts repeating the process over again. After the sodium gates have been opened for a few milliseconds, faster than that, they then snap shut. But the potassium gates remain open just a little longer. Because the sodium ions have brought positive charges into the cell, the inside of the cell no longer attract potassium ions. And this is because they're more concentrated inside the cell than outside. So they tend to, flow out of the cell, carrying positive charges with them. Now, their exit drives the inside of the axon back to its resting potential. And eventually, the sodium potassium pumps removes that extra sodium ions and then recaptures the escaped potassium ions. So it's that flowing process going in, out, and around, so to speak. Now, when we talk about synapses, a neuron is going to communicate with another neuron by releasing a chemical called a neurotransmitter. And at a specialized junction, which is the synapse, the neurotransmitter molecules will diffuse across a narrow gap into the receptors of that postsynaptic neuron and the neuron on the receiving end of the synapse. So a neurotransmitter can either excite or inhibit the postsynaptic neurons, and this will vary with durations of effect. After a neurotransmitter excites or inhibits a receptor, what happens is it separates from the receptor, ending the message. From that point on, the fate of the receptor molecules will vary. So it could bounce back to re-excite the postsynaptic receptor, or it could diffuse away from the synapse, or it could be reabsorbed by the axon that released it, and that would be called a reuptake. A typical axon has branches, and each ending with a little bulge, it's a little tiny bulge, and these are called presynaptic endings, or terminal buttons, as shown on the slide there. So when an action potential reaches that terminal button, it's going to release the neurotransmitter. Now, the brain has dozens of neurotransmitters. Some on this list that you see on the slide, each of them activates many type of receptors. An excess or a deficit of a particular neurotransmitter actually can lead to some abnormalities with our behaviors, such as people exhibiting Parkinson's disease. This is that condition that affects at least 1 to 2% of people over the age of 65. The primary symptoms are difficulty with initiating voluntary movement, slow movement, tremors, rigidity, as well as depressed moods. So take a look at this slide. I want y'all to make sure that y'all have a good understanding of the different neurotransmitters that's within us that helps with our communications in the brain. The glutamate is of that brain's main excitatory transmitter. Here is going to be where the most synapses are present. It's going to be essential for a lot of our brain activities, including you like learning this material. It helps with our learning. Okay, so one thing you want to know that strokes do actually kill neurons. That's mostly by releasing that extra glutamate. And what happens is it starts to overstimulate them. It gets excitatory and don't never seem to calm down. GABA, which is gamma aminobutyric acid, is the main inhibitory transmitter. And pretty much the type of medications that you see out there that's helping like with anxiety, uh, excuse me, whew, sorry, um, it helps with like anti-anxiety drugs or anti-epileptic drugs, is because what it does is it helps to increase activity of GABA within our synapses. Acetylcholine helps with our muscles, our skeletals, and helps to increase arousal. Dopamine. Now, this one you want to know because this is the one I was just mentioning, talking about Parkinson's. Dopamine would be that neurotransmitter that we're speaking about. It also helps with our memory. It helps with our thinking, our cognition. Usually, in terms of any type of abnormalities, uh, you want to know that antipsychotic drugs helps to decrease the level of dopamine. Um, and the L-DOPA that's used for Parkinson's disease helps to increase that availability. There's also the dopamine hypothesis, which is not mentioned on this slide, but the dopamine hypothesis is where is talking about how when there is too much dopamine, then there is the potential of having schizophrenia. Now with serotonin, this is helping, I call this the woo-saw neurotransmitter because it helps with our emotions and with our behavior. It kind of helps us keep calm, cool, and collected. So a lot of the antidepressant drugs tries to help produce more activity with the serotonin within the synapses. Norepinephrine helps with our memory, our emotions, as well as us being able to recall and feel for meaningful type of events. Yes, there's still more neurotransmitters. I just told you we had billions of different neurons, so of course neurotransmitters are going to be high up there too. However, histamine helps with our being alert and being aroused. When we talk about antihistamines, like when we have to deal with the pollen and we're sneezing and our heads bland, well, antihistamines for those allergies basically helps to block histamine. So with that meaning, if you take a Benadryl, antihistamine, you become drowsy, okay? Because it's blocking that alertness and arousal to kind of help you to allow your body to rejuvenate and break up that allergic reaction. When we talk about endorphins, we're talking about how it helps with our pain and pleasure, all right? Have you ever had to take any type of painkillers that's like morphine? I'll never forget my first experience. I had a gallbladder removed, but when I had the gallbladder attack, it was one of the most excruciating pains imaginable. So I had to go to the hospital, and I went to the hospital, and at that time, the morphine derivative was called Demerol. They gave me a shot of Demerol, and when I say it was instant, no sooner than they took me and gave me a needle and shot that Demerol within the bloodstream, I immediately was like, "Woo!" And I literally said that too. That's just how it felt. It just took every bit of pain away. Um, but morphine as well as heroin will help to stimulate those receptors that we have in those endorphins. Nitric oxide helps to dilate our blood vessels and it's the most active within our most active brain areas. This is the only transmitter that is kind of like a push forward, a gas type of neurotransmitter. Anandamide or 2AG, as well as others, can be used within the postsynaptic neuron that helps to back to the presynaptic neuron. And what this does is just help to release other neurotransmitters. So drugs like marijuana, THC, what they do is they go within those presynaptic areas and help to entice. Okay, so moving on. Now we're going to talk about drugs itself, period. Hopefully, after we go over this particular module, you'll be able to have a good understanding about synapses and what's its effect and influences in terms of how drugs affect the behavior. We'll be starting to look at the different classes of drugs, such as the stimulants. Like this is my cup of coffee, so it's caffeine. Excuse me. Hallucinogens, anoxacylics, as well as opiates. And we've all heard a lot about opiates lately. We'll then look at the known and common abuse type of drugs. So this table and slide you're looking at right now summarizes the effect of several drugs. Stimulant drugs are going to be such as those like amphetamines and cocaine. These increase activity levels as well as pleasure by increasing the release and decreasing the reuptake of dopamine and certain other neurotransmitters. When we're talking about dopamine, these synapses are going to be critical for almost anything that strongly motivates people. This ranging from sex to food to music, gambling, video games. You kind of get the understanding. The behavioral effects of stimulant drugs. This now depends on the dosage levels. Okay, low levels will enhance attention, but the higher doses, amphetamine, actually like cocaine, will start to lead to confusion, impairment of attention, as well as becoming more impulsive. Physical effects will include a higher heart rate, blood pressure, body temperature, as well as a risk of convulsions, lung damage, and heart attacks. As the amphetamine or cocaine gets into our brain, what happens is it starts to increase the arousal and then it'll produce these pleasant effects. However, because these drugs are going to be inhibiting the reuptake of dopamine and other transmitters, the transmitters will start to wash away from the synapses much faster than the presynaptic neurons can replace them. So over the next few hours, the presynaptic neurons will supply of transmitters starts to dwindle, and a person that took the drugs will begin to experience mild lethargy as well as depressive symptoms, and this can last until the neurons start to rebuild their supply again. Now, Ritalin, uh, this works the same way as cocaine do at the same synapses. However, the difference is that the methylphenidate will reach the brain gradually over an hour or more, and then it starts to decline slowly over several hours. So it does not produce that sudden rush that makes cocaine so addictive. Now, I'm going to ask for a moment because we're going to talk about caffeine, so I decided I want to take a sip of my caffeine. Coffee. But depressants are drugs that decrease arousal. Alcohol, the most widely abused drug in the U.S., relaxes people and it relieves their inhibitions. You ever met a person who, during the normal times when they're sober, they're very quiet, meek, somewhat timid, but let them get a few drinks in them, and then they're the life of the party, or the loudest person, or the most aggressive person you ever met. Well, that's because the alcohol has kind of started working on those inhibitions by alleviating them so much, putting them in a box, so to speak. It can also impair our judgment, our level of reasoning. Alcohol acts by facilitating inhibitory synapses. So that's about alcohol. But let's talk about caffeine. What caffeine do to our nervous system is it blocks those chemicals that inhibits the arousal. And what that does is increases energy and alertness. But for some people, like myself, um, whereas everybody else get alert and bouncy, I think I drink so much of it that I can actually get sleepy. Rather than sleeplessness, I actually get sleepy from drinking coffee, and I think that's just because I do an overload. But one of those risks are uh, dealing with insomnia. Some people who drink coffee, they shouldn't drink coffee in the evening because then they will not get to sleep. Um, and me and my physician, we argue about that because he says, well, that's why you're up all night because you drink coffee all day long. And I'm like, yeah, but I drink a cup of coffee before I go to bed. Heck, so go figure. Now, nicotine. And I guess this is just my slide, but what nicotine do as far as the nervous system goes, it'll stimulate some of those acetylcholine synapses, and it stimulates neurons that would help to release dopamine. So the effects of the nicotine basically increases our arousal. The abstention by a habitual smoker, unfortunately, it helps to produce some kind of tension or relieves tension somewhat, as well as depression. Of course, cigarettes can lead to cancer, as well as other issues and problems that's not listed, such as it actually can be a contributor to strokes. It can impact your ability in terms of weight loss. It can impact your teeth, corrode the teeth. There's a whole lot of problems with this. Okay, and just a reminder in terms of the no, those two, by the way, are stimulants. I'm sorry. The depressants, which I already talked about, the alcohol is going to pretty much impact the GABA. And again, remember that's the inhibitory neurotransmitter. So it'll help with relaxation, it's reducing inhibitions, it impairs our judgment and thinking as well as our ability to recall. All right, so now anoxaxilic drugs or tranquilizers, they kind of help people to relax. The most common examples are going to be those benzodiazepines, and these will include diazepam, otherwise known as Valium, and alprazolam, also known as Xanax. Benzodiazepines are going to be used to help to relieve anxiety as well as promote sleep. Just like alcohol, anoxaxilics act by facilitating inhibitory synapses. Now, narcotics are drugs that'll produce drowsiness, insensitivity to pain, as well as decreased responsiveness. Opiates are going to be either natural drugs that's derived from the opium poppy or synthetically made drugs with a chemical structure that resembles those natural opiates. And as you know, we have an opioid epidemic right now. Epidemic. So drugs can be like morphine, the heroin, methadone, as well as codeine, um, which these can bind to specific receptors in the brain. Now, the immediate effect of opiates will be pleasurable, and it helps to relieve pain. However, what it can do over the long haul, or with abuse or taking too much of, can stop your heart. Okay. Marijuana. Marijuana has always been a difficult drug to classify. But what it does is it softens pain, but not as powerful as an opiate would. It produces an illusion that time is passing more slowly than usual. But marijuana's effects do not include the more extreme sensory distortions like LSD would. It has a calming effect, but not like that of alcohol or tranquilizer. Marijuana has several potential medical uses. It helps to reduce nausea, it suppresses tremors, it can reduce the pressure within your eyes, it decreases cell loss in the brain after a stroke. But because of legal restrictions in some states, there's still limitations on the amount of research that has been done in terms of talking about marijuana. But the good news is it's becoming legalized slowly but surely. Here in the state of Mississippi, it's still a big controversy. It's still illegal. Medical marijuana, liquid form, has been put on the table to be approved for usage, but hasn't quite passed the threshold just yet. So, yes, it's still illegal in the state of Mississippi. Now, marijuana's active compound is going to be that THC. Basically, it acts on abundant receptors. Marijuana acts on receptors on the presynaptic neuron, putting the brakes on release or both excitatory as well as inhibitory transmitters. Now let's move on to hallucinogens. These induce sensory distortions. LSD attaches mainly to one kind of serotonin receptor. And what it does is stimulate those receptors at irregular times that prevents neurotransmitters from stimulating them at the normal times. So one result can be that it'll decrease in communication among the brain areas, such as our sensory and emotional experiences that occur without the usual guidance and restraint that our frontal cortex would be able to provide. Ecstasy or MDMA produces stimulant effects at low doses and hallucinogenic effects at higher doses. So, excuse me, many young adults use MDMA as parties to increase that energy. However, as that drugs start to wear off, people will start becoming lethargic, they'll start feeling depressed. MDMA increases body temperature and sometimes to dangerous levels. It can shoot you up way past 104, 105. There's been several studies that have been reported to persistent depression, anxiety, memory loss, when the MDMA is being abused heavily. Another risk, though, with MDMA is that it can produce liver damage. Profolinol and GHB. Now, this has attracted a lot of attention because these are considered date rape drugs. What it does is relax the body as well as impair muscle coordination and memory and induce drowsiness. PCP or angel dust, this hits that glutamate receptor, and the person who takes it will start feeling intoxicated. Speeches become slurred, they start having hallucinations, um, tend to become so disoriented that they have a thought disorder, as well as have problems with their emotions and memories. Generally speaking, with PCP, definitely going to have a psychotic break here. Now, we come to module 3.3, and this is talking about our behavior with our brains. And so hopefully what you'll be able to get from this particular section will be how scientists will favor monism. You'll be able to look at the different examples of brain damage and how it impacts our behaviors. We'll be taking a look at how we study and measure brain activities. You'll be able to tell me about the different ways of brain plasticity, as well as being able to define the binding problem. Now, You can use all of your brain, not some percentage of it. You know how we hear, oh, we only use 10% of our brains. No, we use our entire brain, okay? Although most people take for granted that their mind is separate from the brain, evidence has pointed to the contrary. Mind activity and brain activity are the same thing. So to lose part of one is going to be to lose part of the other. All right? So, two important points to remember when studying the brain: use all of it. And the concept of monism is viewing that consciousness is inseparable from the physical brain. According to monism, mental activity is brain activity. Without a mental activity, without it going on, those firings that we just talked about with the neurons, you'll be in a state of rest all the time. Okay? Excuse me. Now, let's talk about the central nervous system. It consists of the brain as well as the spinal cord. Here's communications with the rest of the body by the peripheral nervous system, and this is consisting of nerves that's connecting the spinal cord with the rest of the body. So within the peripheral nervous system, what happens is we distinguish the somatic nervous system. This connects to the skin and muscles, and the autonomic nervous system connects to the heart, the stomach, as well as other organs. Sensory nerves bring information from other body areas to the spinal cord, and those motor nerves will take information from the spinal cord to our muscles, where they'll start to cause contractions. So looking at that figure, basically what it is summarizing how these major divisions of the nervous system actually occur and work. So you could pause the video at this point, take a look and break it down. You want to kind of have a good understanding of it because, yeah, when we go to take that test in a couple of weeks, it'll be in there somewhere. Now, the cerebral cortex. The vertebrate brain has three major divisions, that being the hindbrain, the midbrain, as well as the forebrain. If we talk about fish and amphibians or reptiles and birds, the midbrain actually constitutes a large portion of the brain. However, in mammals, including us, the forebrain is going to be by far the largest area. And pretty much what it has is consists of hemispheres, that being left and right of the forebrain. Now, the outer covering of the forebrain is known as the cerebral cortex, and this is especially prominent within us, humans. Researchers have been able to describe the cerebral cortex within four lobes, that being the occipital, parietal, temporal, as well as frontal. The occipital lobe is going to be at the rear of your head, about right back here, if you can see what I'm doing, okay? um, and that's where our vision happens, okay? So any damage in this area can cause cortical blindness. Now there's some, not all, but some people with cortical blindness may experience blind sight, and that's the ability to point to or otherwise indicate the direction to a visual stimulus without any conscious perception of seeing anything at all. Some can correctly state an object's color. They can talk about the direction of movement or approximate shape, again, insisting that they are just, guessing. Now, some respond to the emotional expression of a face that they do not see consciously. All right, let's talk about the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe of each hemisphere is located toward the left and right sides of the head. Okay, right about there. This is the main area for auditory or hearing, and it also has some aspects that goes toward vision. Now, people with damage in the auditory parts of the temporal lobe will have impairments in recognizing sequences of sounds, such as in music or speech. The temporal cortex is also going to be important for feeling something with your fingers, as well as being able to detect rates of vibrations. Hearing is, of course, also a perception of the rate of vibration or sound waves that's going to be within the air. In terms of language comprehension, now this depends on part of the temporal lobe. In most cases, the left temporal lobe. People with damage in that area will have trouble understanding speech and remembering the names of objects. Their own speech, grammatical, but lacking most of the neurons, will be hard to understand. In other parts of the temporal lobe, the damage produced more visual deficits. One area in the temporal lobe, which is called the fusiform gyrus, it kind of responds mainly to the sight of our faces. So people with damage there in that area will no longer be able to recognize faces. So if you had damage there, you would no longer know this is Dr. Kearns-Cooper speaking to you because you wouldn't recognize my face. Although they see well in other regards and recognize people by their voices, they can describe facial features, such as this is a person with a round face or has short brown hair, and goes on. But they don't easily recognize the individual themselves. People with damage to another part of the temporal lobe become motion blind. And although they see the size, shape, and color of objects, they do not really have the ability to track the speed or direction of movement. Here, they kind of eventually notice that someone who used to be in one place actually is now in another. And so they must have moved, but they didn't see the movement moment by moment occurring. So for a person with damage in this area, crossing the street can be hazardous because they're not going to have the ability to see the cars actually coming toward them. It'll look stationary to them. Other parts of the temporal lobes are also critical for certain aspects of our emotions. The amygdala, which is a structure within our temporal lobe, responds strongly to our emotional situations. People that have damage to the amygdala are going to be slow to be able to process that emotional information, such as, again, the use of our facial expressions. We use our face to tell how we feel. And I'm one of those people who do not have a poker face. My husband tells me all the time, he says he'll ask me what's wrong out of the blue because he's like, your face is telling me you're upset. And I'll say, I'm not upset. And he's like, it's telling me something different. So I know I don't have a poker face because even within my thought patterns, it's kind of clear to see my emotional state at that point. Okay. But our facial expressions and descriptions, it describes those emotional situations. Now, let's move to the parietal lobe. And that's going to be right about up here. Okay? Yeah, about in the middle, right there. Now, it's just above that anterior, above the occipital lobe. This is specialized for body senses. It helps in terms of our touch, pain, temperature, as well as our awareness of the location of our body parts in space. The primary somatosensory cortex would be like a strip that's in the anterior of the portion of the parietal lobe and has cells sensitive to touch in various body areas. The parietal lobe damage would interfere with our spatial attention. So people with damage here would see an object is, but not where it is, if that makes sense. They kind of have trouble reaching toward it, walking around it, or shifting attention from one object to another. Now, the frontal lobe, okay? This includes our primary motor cortex. It's important for controlling fine movements, such as my ability to move my finger, or if I could lift my foot up, I can't, but if I was able to wiggle my toes, it's responsible for that. And each area of the primary motor cortex basically controls a different part of the body. And there are larger areas that's devoted to the areas we control with precision, that being my tongue, my fingers, and other areas such as my shoulders, my elbows, the elbow muscles within it. Now, the anterior sections of the frontal lobe are called our prefrontal cortex. This is important for our memory of what just happened and as well as what you are planning to do next. Think of your prefrontal lobe as the executor, okay? It's critical for directing attention. The prefrontal cortex also participates heavily with our decision making. People with impairments in the prefrontal cortex, they're going to have these impulsive reactions and decisions because they have trouble imagining how good that might feel. They might feel after one outcome, and then they'll have difficulty because it's how sad or guilty they may feel after another. So yeah, those are the four lobes. And remember, you remember where they are: the occipital, the parietal, the frontal, and the temporal. Okay. All right. Now, I mentioned about having two hemispheres. Now let's talk about their connection. Each hemisphere of the brain has sensory input mostly from the opposite side of the body and controls muscles on the opposite side. So, for example, my waving my right hand to you, the left hemisphere is responsible for that right hand doing what it's doing. Okay? And more or less, the hemisphere differ in other ways as well. For almost all right-handed people and more than 60% of left-handed people, parts of the left hemisphere will control your speech. For most other left-handers, both hemisphere helps to control speech. Now, few people have complete right hemisphere control or speech, and the right hemisphere is kind of more important for certain other functions. That would include the ability to imagine what an object would look like after it rotates, and the ability to understand the emotional connotations of our facial expressions and gestures, as well as voice tone. So the two hemispheres, they're going to constantly exchange information back and forth, and through those, and that's going through the corpus callosum. This is a set of axons that's going to connect that left and right hemisphere of the cerebral cortex. If the corpus callosum is damaged, those two hemispheres will not be able to share information with one another. After damage to the corpus callosum, people can actually describe information only if it enters within their left hemisphere. That's important to know. Okay? Such people, in some ways, will act as if they have separate fields of consciousness. And in some ways, they'll act as if they are unified. Now, now, modern technology enables researchers to develop images showing the structure and the activity of various brain areas in living, waking people. And these methods are really powerful, but the results should be interpreted with caution. So, how do we measure brain activity? We use these different type of instruments, that being the electroencephalograph. I'm going to try that again. The electroencephalograph, EEG. Now, this device helps to amplify those tiny little electrical charges on the scalp. They'll put little tabs right there, okay? And it'll allow them to read the brain activity that way. There's the magnetoencephalograph, MEG, which records the magnetic changes. The positron emission tomography, or PET scan, is that device that helps to record radioactivity, and they have to inject chemicals within you for that to work. Then there's the functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI. Now this is one of those more high-tech type, and it's gotten so much better over the years. There's two types. There's also the magnetic resonance imaging that's not mentioned here, the MRI. But the functional one is going to be that procedure that will use the magnetic detectors outside of the head to help make comparisons of the hemoglobin with or without the oxygen at different spots of the brain. Now, in terms of your subcortical areas, Information from the cerebral cortex will pass through the medulla, and then it's going to enter into your spinal cord. The medulla and the spinal cord receive sensory input from the periphery, and then it sends output to the muscles and your glands. The spinal cord will also control many of our reflexes. So a reflex that's rapid, automatic response to a stimulus, such as unconscious adjustments of your legs while you're walking, or a quick jerk of your hand away if something's hot, or if a bug flies around you, is dealing with that. The cerebellum is part of the hindbrain, and here this is important for any behavior that kind of requires our aiming or timing, such as, like, say we're tapping out of a rhythm, being able to judge with two visual stimuli, being able to move faster, or judging whether one musical tempo would be faster or slower than the other. You get the picture. But it's also essential for our learned responses that require that precise timing. And this could be such as responding to a warning signal. Know that the hypothalamus is right below the thalamus, and that's responsible for our thirst, our hunger, sexual arousal, temperature regulation, as well as other type of motivated behaviors that's dealing with a lot with emotions. The pons is going to be in the area that controls muscles to the head. Our medulla, again, helps to control some of those muscles and sensations and the output for our stomach and intestines. The spinal cord, that's dealing with all the way down the back, those muscles that's going downward. And just to remember, cerebellum means little brain in Latin. All right. So now the autonomic nervous system and the endocrine system. We're going to get started here. I'm going to talk about this slide, and then we're going to call it a day. But the autonomic nervous system pretty much controls the body's organs, preparing them for that emergency activity or for relaxed activities. So the autonomic nervous system has two parts in itself. That being the sympathetic nervous system, which is controlled by a chain of cells lying just outside of your spinal cord. Now, the sympathetic nervous system will help increase your heart rate, your breathing rate, sweating, as well as other processes that's going to be important for vigorous fight or flight activities. It inhibits digestion as well as sexual arousal, which can wait until the emergency is over. So the brain kind of automatically send that information within the spinal cord to say, put a stop to it or let it go, get it going. Okay? The parasympathetic nervous system actually is controlled by cells at the top and bottom levels of our spinal cord. Here, this helps to decrease heart rate. It helps to increase our digestive activities, as well as in general promotes the vegetative type activities that takes place during rest and relaxation. The endocrine system, this consists of organs that will help release hormones into our blood. Okay, so those hormones, like the growth hormone or testosterone and estrogen, that's what the endocrine system will help with. That's those glands that's going to help produce it. Know that a hormone is that chemical that's going to be released by the glands and is conveyed by the blood to either alter the activity to some various organs. I have 2 minutes left before the 50 minutes are up. Again, I want to apologize in terms of our not getting together today. There will be an assignment that will be given so that you can have a way to show your attendance for today. And it'll be in Canvas. I'll probably put a link to it under this video. And have a great weekend. We will get back together on Monday, Lord willing. Take care.